Hi, I'm Beth, creator of dryitcanit.com. I like to share with you recipes, tips, and tricks for dehydrating food and canning food. And today I'm going to show you how I pressure can my version of a Mississippi pot roast. Now, Mississippi pot roast is one of those things that are absolutely delicious, oftentimes made in the oven or in a pressure canner, but I'm going to show you how I can it and what I do to modify the recipe a little bit. It's a delicious roast, but I have to tell you up front that this recipe is a little bit of a rebel recipe, and I'll explain that as we go. So if you're a person that wants to go strictly by USDA tested guidelines, then this recipe is not for you. I've done this recipe, I've tested it with my I can't think of my word, my unit that I have that can measure the temperature in the jars. So for my family, I know that I'm comfortable with it, that it reaches the appropriate pressure. It's my data logger. But you have to decide on your own. And again, this is a recipe that is not scientifically tested, therefore not an approved recipe, but it is delicious. So let's get started. So what I do is I'm starting today with two chuck roasts. Each of those chuck roasts were right around 3 pounds, 2.5 to 3 pounds. So I took and I cubed those into about bite-sized pieces. Now, the reason you want to use a chuck roast is, number one, a little bit cheaper cut of meat than some of the other meats that are out there, but it's also a meat that has a good amount of, a decent amount of fat into it and gives you a good amount of flavor. So I left a slice here, and you can see what the fat is in there, the little bit of white fat. That's good. You want that. That's for flavor. So what I did is I took my roast, and the roasts are oblong, and I sliced those first of all the short way in about 1-inch pieces. Then I end up with something like this, and this is still this is about 1 inch thick, but it's still fairly long, obviously. So what I want to do then is I want to take this, because it's still fairly wide, and I want to cut this lengthwise just to make these pieces a little bit more bite-size. Now sometimes bite-size looks like bite-size and looks like it's a good size on the cutting board, but when you put it in your mouth it's kind of big. So basically I took my strip, cut it in two, and then I'm just going to finish cubing it by slicing it further so that I have cubes. And again, I'm looking for my cubes to be no more than 1 inch thick. And like so, I have my cubes. All right, so I'll just put those in my pile. I'm working, of course, with cold meat. Now, the other thing is when you have the chuck roast, oftentimes you're going to have this fat on it, or what I call tallow. It's pretty hard when you push on it. You don't really want that on the roast, so I would say anything that has the tallow in it, you want to get rid of that because it really doesn't add anything. It's extra fat and sometimes it's kind of bristly. So a little bit on here, this is soft, that I'm not worried about. But these harder pieces, like I'll cut this, fairly thick, and if I squeeze it, it's fairly hard. I don't want that. And there's just really not any meat here, so that's just going into the garbage. So do trim out any of those thicker pieces. The first of my 2 roasts didn't have a lot of that, but the second one did have it. But I have nice veining in this roast. So, and actually I'm going to trim the piece I said was okay just a tiny bit, like so. Now, what I do is I take my 2 roasts, and I'm going to can in pints today, simply because that is the size I prefer. You can certainly do this recipe in quarts. But I want to take my 2 roasts and I want to put those in a bigger bowl, primarily so that you can see them. But also, you know how you buy steak sometimes, or even hamburger or roast, and one is really delicious and the other one's good but not quite as flavorful? Well, I like to take my 2 roasts and mix them up. In other words, I'm going to wash my hands here quick. Put them together and then mix them up so that the meat that had a little bit more veining in it is mixed with the meat that had not quite as much veining in it, because that veining, or those little pieces of fat, and here's a piece that's way too big that didn't get cut. Hang on, I'm going to go ahead and cut this real quick. So the pieces that have you know, the veining in it is going to have the fat, and that's where a lot of the flavor is in a chuck roast. So just mix, if you're working with more than one roast, just mix them up together so that you have a good mix of the two roasts together in your jars. Now, here's what else I do then. Now, a lot of the Mississippi pot roasts will call for butter. I don't feel that's necessary. I feel it adds extra fat, doesn't really add any extra flavor. If you have a good quality chuck roast, I think you're good to go. What you're going to do is take 1 package of ranch dressing, any brand you want, and 1 package of brown gravy mix. This is what makes it Rebel recipe, because generally it's advised not to do canning when you have flour or dairy or eggs or gravy. And this is a gravy packet, okay? The other ingredient, and this one is really important, is a jar of pepperoncini peppers. Now, I'm not normally a big pepper fan. These are pickled peppers. They're mild. They add so much flavor to the roast, it's unreal. So, generally my rule of thumb is 1 package of brown gravy mix, 1 package of ranch mix per chuck roast. I have 2 chuck roasts, so I'm going to use both packets. Now, I'm not going to add any liquid to this recipe. So technically I'm using a dry pack or a raw pack, which people use the terms differently, and I suppose there is technically a right way to do that, but I'm going to be packing all raw ingredients and dry in that I'm not adding a lot of liquid. There is going to be some liquid from the pepperoncini peppers here. So, because I have 2 roasts, added 2 packages of ranch seasoning mix and 2 packages of brown gravy mix. Again, this is what's going to make this a Rebel recipe. And then I'm just going to stir this to coat this. Now, if you prefer to brown your meat and pack it that way, pack it hot, you can do that. I would go ahead and do that after I've seasoned the meat. It still is a Rebel recipe because you are using a gravy mix. So basically, I'm just coating all of my pieces of meat here, and I want to make sure that I get to the bottom of my jars, or my bowl here. So basically, I have most of my pieces coated. Just turn it a little bit more here, because I still see some raw pieces coming up here. So basically, I've got that good flavoring on all of them. Now, the pepperoncini peppers are something that you can add as much or as little as you want to. I add this to my jars rather than to my meat, and I'll explain how I go through that. But do get these. They're available at most grocery stores. I get mine at Walmart. They're probably available in different brands. This just happens to be the brand that I have always worked with. And I like to have 2 or 3 peppers per pint jar, 4 to 5 per quart jar, as well as a couple tablespoons of the juice that's in here. Makes a huge difference. Let's talk about packing the meat. So when you're working with this particular recipe, and because I'm going to do the dry pack or the raw pack, whatever you want to call it, I want to get as much meat into my jars as I can. So I'm going to pack it tightly. These jars are going to get, or the meat is going to give off liquid as it cooks, so you don't need to add that. Now, if you prefer to add hot water to this, you can, but it's going to make your gravy probably thicker. And I don't know if that, I haven't tested it that way, so I don't know that I'm comfortable recommending that. But you want to put this meat in here, pack it with a spoon, pack it to the 1-inch mark. So again, I think I'm there. That 1-inch mark, remember, is that bottom lip. So I'm going to go ahead, I can't really debubble these because they don't have liquid yet. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pack the rest of these jars, and then I'm going to be back and show you how I finish this before I put it in the canner. My jars are now packed, and I packed them for the most part up, not quite up to this 1-inch mark. I think the first one was maybe the fullest, but you want to pack that meat in as tight as you can. But as you can see, it's not really filled all the way to the 1-inch mark all the way around. And that's where I fill with my peppers and my juice. So what I like to do with this, because I'm splitting that juice a little bit, is I like to first of all take those peppers and then just drain that pepperoncini juice into a glass container or a bowl or something, because I think it's a little bit easier to measure out into my jars. So like so. Now, I like to put about 2 peppers in here into each one of these jars. And you know, you could put these peppers really in the middle of the jar if you wanted, but it's never really an issue. They do have stems on them, and you're not going to eat the stems, or at least I don't think anybody eats the stems, but that's fine. I can't even explain the flavor level that these give. I was a little bit leery about using something called pepperoncini peppers because I didn't even understand what they were, and I'm not a person that likes really spicy food. But when I tried this, I thought I'll never make a roast again the other way. And I do make a roast the other way sometimes, but this really is my favorite way to do it. Now, I have my liquid here, and this was a, let's see, what size is this? This is a 16-ounce jar, and my liquid gave me not quite a cup, about 3/4 of a cup. So what I'm going to do is I'm just taking a tablespoon here of liquid, and I'm putting that into each of the jars. And again, this is a pickled pepperoncini pepper recipe. So you can kind of imagine a little bit what it tastes, but it's not peppered, it's not pickled at all. Then I take the rest of the liquid and I just put it back in my jar because I'll be able, these keep really well in the refrigerator once the jar is opened, and I'll be able to use this another time. I have 5.5 jars basically. This last jar isn't quite full, but I'll go ahead and put that in my canner anyway, and I'll actually use that one for demonstrating afterwards. Now, I have to get something to wipe the ends of my lids off, and I'll be right back. All right, working with meat, so I want to make sure there's no grease on the lips of my jar. So I just take a clean rag, dipped in vinegar, and wipe the rims of all my jars to make sure that all that fat is removed. Now, if you were doing these in quart-sized jars, then obviously my recommendation would be to double the amount of peppers and double the amount of juice that you put into the jars. And you might find as you go that you like more pepperoncini flavor or a little bit less, and you know, after you try the recipe, A, you're gonna love it, but B, you can adjust it accordingly. So I've wiped off the rims of all my jars, and now I'm simply going to put my lids on. I'm not adding any liquids. I'm starting with a cold jar. In other words, my jar hasn't been preheated. Cold food and cold water in my canner. So I'm going to put all of these lids on. I'm going to pressure can this for 75 minutes. I have an electric pressure canner. But for 75 minutes, the meat is going to make the juice. If you're doing quarts, you want to do it for 90 minutes. As far as the pressure, if you have a dial gauge or a weighted gauge, you know, check the directions on your canner to see what pressure you should have that for meat, and then use that accordingly. But again, this recipe is super simple, super delicious. I'm going to go ahead and pressure can mine now for the 75 minutes. When it's done, I will show you. I will take, I got out of that about 6 pounds of roast, I got about 5 3/4 jars. This one that's not quite full, I'm going to go ahead and pressure can that also, but I'm also going to use it right away. I'm going to actually open it up and demo it for you once it's all done, but I'll also use it for lunch tomorrow. Generally, you do want to have your cans full if you're going to put them in storage, simply because you have that extra air. There really wasn't enough juice in here to debubble it, so that's why I'm not doing that step today. So I'm going to go ahead, get these into my canner, pressure can them. I'm going to take them out, I'm going to let them cool, and then I'll be back either this evening or tomorrow to show you the end result. I will put a link to the recipe below. The pepperoncini peppers, I know that they're available at Walmart. I'll have a link to those too if you need to have that, but otherwise just check your grocery store. Do try this recipe. If you liked this, please give me a thumbs up. That helps me know what kind of recipes you like. And I would really appreciate you subscribing to the channel. If you look in the lower, let's see, it's your left. I'm not sure which way it is when I'm pointing, but in the lower, no, it's going to be your lower right corner. my left maybe on the camera, there's a subscribe button. Please hit that. You'll get notified when I upload videos, and if it's a video that you're interested in, you'll be able to follow along. So come on back if you're interested in seeing the end result. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in and subscribe. So my 2 roasts, which were around 6 pounds of meat, made 5.5 pints of pot roast. This one was a half of a jar, and I'm going to open it up and taste it and show you how good it is. This is delicious on top of rice, noodles, mashed potatoes. It's definitely a family favorite. I have very little fat actually in this particular jar. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the 2 peppers that I put in the jar out, and those are absolutely 100% edible and delicious. And you can see all the meat and the gravy that's in here. Let me just pour this on here so that you can see what I have. You can see I have delicious gravy. I'm not going to pour quite all of it on since I have this plate, but then I have these beefy chunks of meat, and they do shrink a little bit. So that's why I say cut them a good bite size, about an inch. Tender, delicious. Flavorful, a really good instant meal, great to have in your pantry. So again, I've got a link below to the recipe. It's super simple to make. Adjust the ingredients as you want. If you like this, I sure would appreciate a thumbs up. More importantly, please consider subscribing to the channel in your lower left corner. Thanks for watching. Happy canning.